Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Off the Shelf. This is a reader engagement program headed by our own Dawn Gepfer as a part of Sisters in Crime Atlanta chapter. I'm Lance Barron, the 2023 chapter president, and we're very lucky to have with us today Jeff Shaw, who is a thriller writer, and he comes to us by way of South Florida, where he grew up and served as a law enforcement officer for 24 years, and a lot of that as a homicide sergeant during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Now he's moved away from that placid and calm area of South Florida to the hectic pace of North Georgia. And his most recent book is the second in the Bloodline series, and it is Leanne and the Clean Man, which is a continuation of the search for the veteran killing serial killer laid out in his first book, Lieutenant Trufant. So welcome, Jeff. We're very excited to have you today. And Dawn, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And before we get started, I want the audience, please feel free to ask questions. You can put them in the chat. Lance will be keeping an eye on the chat, and he can ask it for you, or please speak up. We want our audience to be involved in these programs. So please feel free to join in freely. And with that said, hello, Jeff. How are you today?
Good. Good morning. Nice to be here.
We are very excited to have you. Jeff is a member of Sisters in Crime Atlanta. And so he has 3 books currently under his belt. And we are so excited to get to know a little bit about his writing. But before we do that, we always like to have our authors share their story with us, aside from being a writer. So we call this the backstory. And so, Jeff, please tell us about yourself leading up to your career in writing.
Okay. I was born in South Florida. I was born in Hialeah, Florida, which is a big part of the giant Miami metropolis. It's where I grew up and went to school. At the time, I had no idea that I would ever become a writer. In fact, I remember having a lot of trouble started out probably in middle school and then later high school. I had never been part of the cool crowd, or the musicians, the jocks, the nerds. Even the nerds had a lot more friends than I did. I felt like I was like an outsider, but I think in truth, I was just an introvert, and maybe had a little ADD, which at the time they just called being lazy. And I was the guy looking out the window in the English class, not paying attention. I just didn't have an interest in learning how to put together a proper paragraph, or what a semicolon was and where it went. So, I was interested in other things. I did really well in history because I found it interesting, great grades, but English, not so much. So I graduated with the idea that I wanted to become a pilot. So within a year, I got my pilot's license. And at the same time, Vietnam was ending, and all these pilots coming back from the war with thousands of hours in complex jets were kind of in their job market. And here I am with 100 hours in this little tin can Cessna. I just realized, I'm not going to be able to compete. So I bounced around from different jobs, mostly like trade construction. I was a cook at a restaurant for a while. And I had expressed my frustration with one of the cops that used to come into the restaurant when I was a cook. It was a slow time. I would sit with him. His daughter and my sister were friends. And he said, Jeff, you should put an application in to be a police officer. The city is giving a test soon. So 2 years later, I got hired. It took that long for my name to be processed through the process. And then I got the letter, congratulations. So I started the academy in August of 1979. And the academy was tough for me. Now I'm exposed to all these other people, and that introversion I had to deal with that. I think I improved some over that, and so later I wrote a memoir, but I'll get back to that later. But in that academy thing, two really things came to me and stuck out or were important to me. The first was 3 weeks in the academy, I attended a full autopsy. And you can imagine, if you've not been in that kind of position, it's very eye-opening. You're right up next to the table, and there's no getting away from what's happening in front of you. So that was an experience that I can still remember very vividly.
Yeah, you reminded me of that Quincy in the beginning of Quincy, where he's doing an autopsy and the policemen are lined up and they one by one they fall out.
We had people having to leave, getting nauseous. They had to go out, but nobody actually passed out. Also in that another movie where I don't remember the character's name. I think it was Sean Penn. He's standing over an autopsy and oh, gnarly. That was a big part of that movie. But so that was pretty interesting. And then later, part of the academy, we would go out with a train. We'd go back to our departments as civilians, but ride with a police officer. And that night, I ran into my very first homicide. We were dispatched to a fight in a field, and this officer and I found a man laying in these tall weeds, and he had a screwdriver stuck in his chest, and he was, dead as a doornail. So that was kind of a shock to my system, something like preparing me for the future. So I graduated. The academy was 5 months later. I graduated, got out on the road in 1980. Worked for a couple months with a field training officer sitting next to me. And then my very first night alone, I was dispatched. I was on a midnight shift, driving around, waiting for that first call. And the very first call was a mass shooting, and it was my call. So you can imagine now I'm standing over this dying man, kneeling down, talking to him, telling him, I got you, you're going to be okay. And then he dies on me. I watched that experience of death right there. I'm 26 years old, I'm a rookie. And, it was just so surreal, I guess, that thing. But it really imprinted that whole call, that whole night into my brain. And I can still remember it like one of those flashbulb memories that, you have when the space shuttle crashed, all that stuff. We remember those things pretty vividly, where we were, who we were talking to when it happened. So I had many of those things over my career. So I did 24 years, and during that 24 years, I went into various positions. I taught at the police academy for a couple of years. I was in SWAT a couple of years. Then when I was promoted, I was out of SWAT and I went into hostage negotiations, which is very, we're linked with SWAT. We kind of work together. So got a lot of great training and experience and education, learning about mental illness and how to negotiate with people like that. And then went on and I can't remember what year I transferred into homicide. And I spent my last 3.5 years in homicide dealing with, death, really, homicide, and not just the death itself, but hunting them down, hunting the killers down and sitting across from them at a desk, listening to them confess to whatever horrors they committed. And there were some really brutal calls during my career that to this day, I can't sit down and really relate. They're just too horrific. But in the memoir, which I started writing after I graduated, I went into a lot of detail with not just what the scene was like, but how it felt to drive home that night, and even how it still affects me today. Um, so when I retired, which was another monumental event, I went from being a homicide sergeant, which was one of the most sought after positions in law enforcement, at least in our department. You know, I was mingling with judges and state attorneys, and you know, there was medical examiners. It was very interesting. And I went in one day from that position to be an unemployed old man, you know, and it was, at first it felt like a long vacation, and then the depression starts. Everybody had warned me, expect depression. And I thought, no, not me. I was made to retire. But sure enough, after maybe a month, I started feeling that I'm just an unemployed man. I'm nobody. You know, I was at home, stay-at-home mom, you know, with my kids who were in preschool while my wife was still working. She was in our communications division. She couldn't retire yet. So I was a stay-at-home mom, and that depression got to me. Here I am changing diapers and making, you know, mac and cheese and all that stuff. And it was depressing. But then I started writing the memoir. And at first it wasn't a memoir. It was just like little things that I remembered from work that I thought my kids would be interested in reading later in life, because my dad had done that for me. But I met an author who I went to school with. She lives in Woodstock, Georgia now. Susie Clotfelter Jemerson. She said, when we just rehooked up after 20 years, she said, Jeff, I wrote a book. I'm having a book launch down here in Woodstock. Would you come and we can catch up? So I did, and I mingled with some authors and publishers and her editor, and then those little notes I had started writing became the memoir, and it took 15 years for me to finish that. I had to relearn how to write. Remember, I had trouble in school just putting a paragraph together. Then I started writing police reports every day, you know, dozens a day. And so I learned how to do a narrative, the police narrative, that, you know, who, what, when, where, you know, no drama. They don't care if it was cold or hot outside, you know, and were you emotionally affected by this call? So I had to learn how to add those things into my story. And I had a lot of help through, you know, fellow authors. I went to seminars, I went to writing retreats, I joined author clubs. I became a member of the Atlanta Writers Club, where I met some great mentors that really helped me along. And then I joined up here the Blue Ridge Poets and Writers. And so, you know, we sit down once a month and critique each other. Those kinds of things really helped me. And I learned so much writing that memoir. And while I was writing it, some friends suggested, Jeff, you need to really write what you know, write crime. Because I was kind of set on science fiction. And one day, driving through San Francisco with my kids, and in the backseat of an Uber, I see this homeless man walking down the street with a black Labrador. You know, San Francisco right now, it looks horrible with all the homeless people. You know, you have to have empathy for them, but I also had a lot of empathy for the city the way it was, because my parents worked there in the 80s. And so within like 30 minutes of seeing that man, I'm sitting in the hotel with my laptop, and that homeless man with a dog became my first chapter in my crime novel, Lieutenant Trufant. And it's David Armstrong, and the dog is Travis. So those became my first scene of Lieutenant Trufant, was that homeless man. And within hours, I pretty much had the idea of where I wanted that book to go. And it's basically a serial killer killing homeless veterans in the city. It's been doing it for years. 2 specific dates during the year, a homeless veteran is killed. And the lieutenant, they don't have any clues. The man doesn't leave anything forensic on the scene to really understand what's happening. But they get a cryptic letter in the mail several days later. And it's usually a quote from Shakespeare about revenge. So that's all he has to work with. So, you know, that plot plays on, you know, and it deals a lot with the drug issues down there, and the PTSD of the veterans, and the PTSD that Lieutenant Trufant goes with too, trying to deal with the stresses of this case. But ultimately, it's also about redemption. You know, that's the plot arc, you know, the redemption. And then I finished that. I wrote it as a standalone novel. There's no cliffhangers at the end. It's all wrapped up nice and tidy. But while I was finishing that book, there was a character I introduced in there. She's got a very small part, and that's Leanne. She's the youngest member of this family that's involved in Lieutenant Trufant. Leanne is a killer in her own right. She's not really a psychopath. She's more of a sociopath with the OCD of when anybody really offends her or victimizes her, she just can't let it rest. And usually is very violent the way she overcomes that anxiety of dealing with somebody victimizing her. So she's fleeing from law enforcement and goes to Singapore. And I've never been to Singapore, but it was one of those cities that to me had this like mystique. Growing up as a kid, watching maybe black and white movies, you know, Bob Hope going to Algiers or whatever. Singapore was one of those. There's others like Macau and Monaco and Hong Kong that just had this kind of a, I don't want to say I ever put any of them on my bucket list, but I always just felt them interesting cities. So I thought, well, I picked Singapore as where Leanne is going to take place. Almost the entire novel takes place there, and I've never been there. So it took a lot of research, a lot of Googling, and you know, I did a lot of street views and learned the cultures and what they eat and the food and everything. And you're not familiar with Singapore, it's almost split 50-50 with things from the West, because they were a colony, a British colony for so long, and the East with all the Asian cultures. Even their names are very confusing. And so in the very beginning of Leanne, I even brought that up like an author from the notes. Be prepared. There are names like Tommy Fong is a character. That's a very, you know, his given name with his surname afterwards. But then there's also Kwan Kim Lai, where it's an Asian version of the name, and the surname is switched. So I didn't want people to be confused. But English is also a very common language there, so I didn't have problems with translations or anything. So Leanne lands in Singapore, and she's abducted by this drug and sex trafficking ring. And so her story is basically one of revenge and in her own right, redemption. Remember, she's a killer. Even in her very first opening scene, you deal with her anger to her seat passenger in this plane. And so it gives you a good idea of Leanne's personality. And so she goes through a little character arc where you actually find yourself kind of rooting for her. That was kind of a challenge for me. I'm going to take this crazy killing girl and make you want to like her. Leanne is 20, becomes 21 during the novel. She's young, and in my head, I was picturing a character like Elizabeth Salander in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I don't know if you remember her. That character was a little older than Leanne. But after I had Leanne already set up and established in my brain of who she was, I watched the series Wednesday. I don't know if any of you ever watched that series, Wednesday. The actress's name is Runa Mara. She's young. I think in real life, she's also 20, 21 years old. but I was thinking, that's my Leanne. She is very antisocial, doesn't like people getting close to her, hugging her, or doing any of those things. So I kind of see it, I was kind of seeing Wednesday as my Leanne character as well. So it took me a while to get all those things established, and I published Trufant in 2020. No, I published the memoir in 2020, right as the COVID hit, and we were all in lockdown. It's very frustrating, and at the same time, we went through all the anti-police media on the news. It was horrible, I think, for police officers and the country as a whole.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to try and promote a police memoir. But I did. And then I published Lieutenant Trufant in 2022. And then I just published Leanne in March of 2023. And I'm about, I think, 3/4 of the way through a not so rough first draft of the next story, and I'm really struggling on a title. So it'll be right now it's Trufant number 3, and so I'm working with some friends on figuring out how I'm going to title it.
Jeff, I had a question from the audience about what made you choose a woman in the Leanne book.
I think part of it was the same reason I picked. I had Trufant as an African American. It was almost a challenge, and this goes back to when I was first learning to write. When I submitted my first science fiction novel, one of my critiques from the editor was that my characters were too white and too old, and kind of frustrated me because I didn't really feel like I was writing them that way. But then when I was doing the rewrites, I realized that the editor was correct. So I really made it an effort to bring in, a lot of diversity. So it was kind of a challenge. And same thing with Leanne. When I wrote Leanne's character, and we meet Leanne halfway through Trufant, where she walks through a cemetery dressed in this red evening gown, going out to the club type of dress at a funeral type service. And I just thought that would be a great character for the next novel. She's very mysterious in Trufant. She really frustrates her mother, and you start realizing there's something about Leanne that I wanted to flesh out, but not in that book.
Interesting. So there was something that your own character captured your attention and made you decide,
Right.
hey, I want to develop her a little bit further.
And it's really true. You hear that from people, but they do talk to me. I'll be laying in bed, thinking about my next scene, and it's like my character is telling me what he wants to do. What would, and so, but it's very true.
We hear that sometimes from authors when through Sisters in Crime, and they say my character was telling, I was just doing what my character was telling me to do when I was writing this all down. And as a reader and not a writer, I have yet to experience that, but maybe someday. I do have a question for you, because you said that the book you're working on right now is, you're calling it Trufant number 3. But am I understanding that even though the stories are connected, Lieutenant Trufant is connected to Leanne and the Clean Man, is Trufant in number 2 a lot in the Leanne story?
He has a very brief mention at the very beginning.
Okay.
He is still in the process of what's happening in the original Trufant book. He's in the airport to leave to go take care of something, which I don't want to spoil anything.
Okay, don't.
But Leanne is also in the same airport at the same time, running from not just Trufant, but law enforcement in general. I don't know if trying to explain that any further would be like a spoiler or not.
No,
But
that's good.
like I said, she did. The FBI is aware that she has killed a couple of people, and she is wanted in the United States.
Okay.
So her idea is just to go to a safe house that her family had acquired years ago in Singapore.
And so you actually call this series
The
The
Bloodline.
Bloodline. Will you explain why why it's called that?
Okay, so the Bloodline deals with this Haddad family. They're from Iraq. The mom was born and raised in the Philippines, became a missionary, and went to Iraq to run a Christian school in Iraq, teaching English and Christian ways to this small village. She meets an Iraqi man, they get married and have a family. And that's the bloodline. It's that family blood. And it's kind of based on a true story that happened in Iraq. I had to change it around a little bit based on some feedback from some of the readers. This family is brutalized over there. Some of them are killed, some of them are raped. I tried to keep that at a minimum while I was writing this book, just enough to realize, for most readers to realize, that what would that do to my family? What would that do to my children? How would they grow up? Would they be sane? And so that's some of the problems that are faced when they travel to the United States. The whole family is suffering from that attack, and how they deal with it is what plays out in Trufant.
Mm-hmm.
And then Leanne is probably one of the least affected of them. She's the youngest, really didn't understand what was going on when this attack happened, but she also has her own problems. So is it related genetically? One of the family members worries that, am I going to become like my brother? Is this genetic? Am I predisposed to violence? And that's where the bloodline kind of takes place. And I bring it up several times in Trufant, and then again in Leanne.
And will you kind of carry that thought into
Yes,
book
two
3?
of those characters follow through into this third one. And Leanne is one of them.
Are you thinking this is a 3-book series, or I guess as you finish up with number 3, you'll be inspired one way or the other, right?
You never know. I kind of felt like I wanted to move on to something else, but I thought that last time, and then somewhere about halfway through during all the editing process, I thought, I have this one more story for 2 months, and that might happen.
Well, you did write something else. I found it on your website, and it really fascinated me. And it was a piece of flash fiction, and it's called Hans.
Oh yeah, that's my favorite.
First off, explain to everyone, in case they don't know, what flash fiction is, and then tell us about how that story came to you and what compelled you.
That is a great question, and I'm glad you asked it.
Okay.
That was part of my learning how to write. I met an editor at that book launch my friend had down in West Woodstock. And I was invited to a writing conference, like a retreat up in Amicalola Falls. I went to 2 of them. And in one of them, and this is where all those mentors with the Atlanta Writers Club come into play. One of our assignments.
The Atlanta Writers Club, AWC.
Alexis explaining what the Atlanta Writers Club is. So one of our projects, like on a Friday night, the very first night, was to write a flash fiction story that is a complete story from beginning to end, with a character and plot arc. And I'd never done any kind of fictional work before, but I remember going to my room with my little laptop and thinking of this story of Hans. And I don't know how it came to me, but Hans is a little boy growing up in Poland in 1939, and we all know where that went. The mayor comes to the house, warns the father of some things happening with the Nazis coming in, and to prepare for this train trip. And so they do. And of course, it's the train to Dachau. You know, that's where they're going. Everybody lied to them. They get packed into this train, and now they're on their way to Dachau. And in the story, which is a little bit of paranormal fiction, there's another word for it, but I can't think of it right now. We follow Hans as he's looking. He wakes up one morning and like people are gone. He's looking for the sergeant at the latrine, and what is he going to do? So he goes to the crematorium, and his job at the very beginning when he got to Dachau was to sweep the ashes out of the crematorium and look for gold and diamonds left over from the ashes. It's a horrible thought when you think about what he's doing, but was the reality of Dachau. And while he's doing this, he hears a little girl talking, and he goes around the edge of the crematorium and he sees this young girl, and they talk back and forth. And the little girl is called away from the conversation, and then Hans hears, and these are the crematoriums of Dachau, and they ran 24 hours a day. And what it is, it's as a tourist guide giving a view to these tourists of what Dachau was in modern times. So Hans has spoken with a girl that's in current times, supernaturally, and that's really where the original flash fiction story ended. Flash fiction is a story, and I've seen where it's sometimes considered 500 words or 1,000 words, and I think ours was 1,000 words, and I came in like at 995 for that story.
Well,
so basically, in reality, Hans died soon after getting to Dachau along with his parents. I lengthened that story into like a novella, which I want to say is closer to 10 or 15,000 words, where after that scene, we go into that little girl and her mom touring Dachau.
mm-hmm.
And so the mom is looking for DNA relatives. You know, she finds out that she's Jewish. She didn't know it at first. She finds out she's Jewish, and she's looking for her roots.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes on from there, and you know, it keeps going.
So if this started out as a writing assignment, how much time did you have to do it? Like a week in between classes?
Just
or
overnight.
Overnight. Well,
overnight. We had to present it the next day in class, and I believe it was George Weinstein read it in class. He was one of the mentors that helped me through a lot of things. There was Marianne Stefanali put on the retreat. George Weinstein was there as like a guest speaker, and really offered me a lot of encouragement. And Jedwin Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Jedwin Smith later wrote read one of my stories out of my memoir about a teen suicide. And he's the one that said, Jeff, this has got to be more than just notes to your kids. You know?
So he was the one who encouraged you.
He encouraged them.
So I'm impressed about how deep you went into that little, flash fiction piece with just an overnight assignment. That's very impressive. And it probably has to do with you being a bit of a history buff. Right. That was the subject in school that you said you enjoyed the most. So for you right. to pull something so meaningful together so quickly without having a lot of time to develop it is very impressive. Before we go too far into the next subject, I do want to say Annie asked a great question, and thinking about what you have been writing, which is number one, a memoir of a very intense career and things that you were exposed to during your career, and then writing about Lieutenant Trufant, who's investigating homicides, and then writing about Leanne, who is a vigilante victim seeking revenge against those who have harmed her. Annie wants to know, are you going to write any comedy, any comedy books?
You know, I've actually thought of it, and I don't know if I have the voice for it. Just yesterday, I went to the dentist, which is not my favorite thing. And I'm sitting there in front of this beautiful window looking out at the mountains. I could see hawks flying around and stuff like this. So the wheels are already spinning as, the hygienist is doing her thing. So I came home and I wrote a humorous story. It's like a flash fiction about my experience in the dentist chair that day. And it's humorous, and I meant it to be humorous. So sometimes I have that voice, but I don't know if I have the chops to do it as a full-length novel. But I am a humorous person, as Annie will tell you. I can, I have a very dark imagination, but I can turn it into humor every now and then.
So I also remember reading, I believe this might have been something you shared on your website, that, and you've already said that, English was not your favorite subject. And here you are writing police reports as part of your career, and you got a little creative with writing your police report. You tried to dress it up a little bit.
Several of them, yeah.
Yeah, why don't you tell us about that? Because that made me laugh out loud.
Okay, well, the first one, maybe the one you're talking about, is when we were writing, it was during a big drought. We had a drought in South Florida, several of them. And the first time we had it, we were supposed to write reports and actually cite people for writing things, but we didn't. We had crime to deal with, I mean, I don't take water shortages lightly, but still, we had serious crime to deal with. And then the next year, the same thing happened. And the mayor was angry because we didn't do anything last time. So he said, if any officers dispatched on these water violations, we had to write a report. We had to get a case number and write a report. So I wrote a report, and I don't remember exactly how it started, but it was something to do with, like, it was the moonlight was glistening off the wet grass, and puddles were forming on the sidewalks, and and then knocking on the door, and I knew that I was face to face with a man who had just watered his lawn illegally. It was a lot longer than that, but I don't remember the exact wordage. And it was fun, and it was also a way for me to vent that frustration of having to write it in the first place. At the time, we were having all these armed robberies committed right in that zone where I'm writing this water report. Tourists were coming out of the Miami International Airport, which was right next to our border, and they were being robbed because their rental cars were real obvious, and the thieves and the robbers were targeting rental cars. And so I wrote that report, and I'm thinking, okay, nobody's even going to read it, And then a day or two later, I get a call from my captain. He says, Jeff, have you read the Miami Herald? I said, no, you just woke me up. I work midnights, So he says, well, be in the chief's office right after roll call. So I immediately run outside, and my Herald is there, in the yard, and I open it up, and the first page of the local section, there's my report. And complete,
Verbatim.
So the chief actually said something like, just don't do this anymore. And I remember the quote, he said, brevity is the soul of wit. And, just keep it short, Jeff. Stop with all the drama.
Well, brevity is the soul of wit, I guess, when you're a police officer. But
right.
As an as a writer, no, we
Right.
do want to embellish and engage and make things interesting. And I'm gonna say, I follow you on Facebook, and you are quite poetic. And so to hear you say that English was, not your favorite subject, I found that surprising. And also to hear that you really don't have any formal training in writing. I'm really impressed with the way you put a sentence together. I
Well,
think you're
I
quite
tell you,
good at
I
it.
really study it. It's like a craft, it's not something to take lightly. So I knew it was a craft and I wanted to learn everything there was. And I don't want to say I plagiarize other people's work, but I just watch to see what they do and what I like. And I try and remember how they did it, their dialogue. And when their dialogue stops and a narrative begins or backstory, how they work all that in there. So I do study it and I try and follow their patterns. And I have so many authors that I revere, so and I know even, when I was 13 years old, I read my first novel front to back. It was Robert Heinlein's. So I know what is good and what is bad, even though I didn't know how to write them myself.
So Annie asked another question. She is curious if you miss your work as a police officer, and do you miss your coworkers?
I miss them all the time. I'm meeting one for lunch this afternoon.
Oh,
He's from
nice.
South Florida. He's traveling through LJ for a wedding, and so we're meeting for lunch. And I've missed them all the time. I just had a cruise with some of them. You hear about soldiers, how they bond in wartime, in the foxhole and all that stuff. Well, police officers go through that also. It's not like that one giant battle in the middle of a battle of the bulge or something, but it's a spread out over your career. We share so much danger and backing each other up. You really build up a great camaraderie with people that are nothing like yourselves, but you still love them. And so I miss them all the time. I do miss the excitement of the job, and we would sit after work sometime and tell war stories. We called it choir practice. But sometimes it's just you're remarking to yourself and your coworkers how you survived this thing. And I still have those stories. And I imagine when I meet Tom up in Blue Ridge that we'll have a few of those stories. So yes, I miss that. I do miss helping people. There's nothing like that experience of helping someone. Arresting criminals is kind of fun too, especially the really violent ones that really hurt people. There's just a satisfying feeling of doing that. But helping people, like I mentioned, standing over the guy, helping him, and he died. That was really tragic. And I remember driving home thinking about how that happened. But sometimes you save people. I pulled a girl out of a lake who was basically dead at the time, and running to the house with her over my shoulder somehow acted like CPR or the Heimlich maneuver or something. And as I'm running, she starts throwing up and breathing. So that's one of the highlights that I can remember, the good things.
Mhm. Are some of these stories in your memoir?
I put them all in there.
Good.
And even the really violent, sad ones. And I talk about what it's like being in that room. The mother's next to me. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? And how it affected me. Because right there, when that call is over, you're going to the next one. There's no time to think about what happened. They don't give any downtime to decompress. You're going to your next call. It could be worse. So how did it feel driving home that night? You're by yourself. You're thinking of all the things you did. Did I do the right things? And then, you tell your wife, oh, I worked a suicide tonight. And that's really all you say. Even though my wife was in police work, I worked a suicide or this homicide. It's terrible, or it's traffic accident, But you don't ever tell any details to your family or to really anyone other than maybe another policeman. But in my memoir, I put it all out there, every bit of it. And, you know, even still how it, like, just talking about the girl in the lake there, I could tell I was struggling a little bit with it. So it still affects you.
Hmm. I bet it does. One review that I read about your memoir, it was from someone who identified themselves as also being in law enforcement. And they said, I would highly recommend this book to anyone who wants insight into real police work. So that's,
True.
to me, that's quite a compliment. And I think it's a good reference for both readers and writers to know that there is this book out there that if they want to either understand a police procedure or police operations, as well as maybe write about it accurately, that your book is considered one to turn to.
I just met a man who just last week who was a police officer and had been shot several times, and he was thinking about writing. And so I talked to him at length about how I did it, and maybe he could use my book like as a template to write his own. I said, you need to start writing right now, though. And every time you write, you know, that night as you're going to bed, you're going to remember more about how it felt. And the next day, get down and write those things too. And eventually you're going to have a story. And that's what it did for me. But I got letters and comments from people all over the country saying, now I know, you know, why my father was so quiet. And or I felt these things all the time too, and I never realized that I wasn't alone, you know. And so a lot of those comments were things that made me feel all that was worthwhile. I remember my wife coming in one day and I was editing the story, and my head's on the keyboard, I'm crying, you know. She's, what is it? What is it? And I would just point to the screen and she would know.
So I was going to ask you when you were talking about kind of the emotional hardships of being a police officer. And I was going to ask you, I was going to say, why did you, what do you think made you stick with it for 24 years?
24 years, yeah. I just felt like, I remember graduating the academy not knowing if this was a profession I wanted, but there's so much reward in the profession, and that's what I was feeding off of. It was very rewarding. I felt like I was contributing. It sounds really corny, but I was contributing to society. I had a purpose now where before I had none. The good friends that I met, and also it's very exciting, you know, even those dark moments, they're exciting. You know, it's like watching a good crime novel, or I mean, watching a good crime movie. It's exciting. You don't want to get up and hit pause, you know, you want to watch it. And all these things are playing out in real life. Car chases, shootings, there was just so many things happening. Every night it was like, what's next?
Well, then along the same lines, how hard was it to give it up after 24 years? Because you did come to love it.
Yeah, it was hard. I remember occasionally when I was in homicide. Now, of course, I'm just new in homicide, and it's a totally different ballgame. And I had a lot of new things to learn, but it got to the point where it was also becoming routine. It's hard to imagine a homicide being routine, but I would walk in and, you know, and unless there was something really unusual about this homicide, it would be routine. Husband finds his wife cheating and shoots her. They're both right there. There's no real investigation. You know, this person shot this person. They're there. There's nothing, no life-saving things happening. As a sergeant, I wasn't really involved in researching all the details of their lives where my detectives would. They would go out and find a family member, what was happening with your parents and things like that. And usually my duties were over as I realized that my men were taking care of it and it was okay. I could leave. All the proper people had been notified, you know, the medical examiners. So it was starting to become routine. And then I had my kids to think of. You know, I want to say my kids were 4 and 5 when I was retiring. They were used to me driving them to daycare in uniform or with my badge and gun. They probably thought every dad did that. And also at the same time, over the years, you build up this shell that helps protect you from all those emotions. You know, it's like you can stand there and take it, and it's not really affecting you. But as I retired, you know, that shell kind of evaporates, and now all those memories were hitting me, and then they were really hard to deal with.
And somewhere along the way, you decided to leave Miami or Hialeah, and come to Georgia, to the Georgia mountains at that.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, my kids in Pembroke Pines, where I was living, were at the age they were about to go into 5th grade, and we lived near the local middle school, and those kids would walk home, and I saw a lot of like gang activity in those kids. You know, they're good kids, of course, walking also, but you would also see the bad ones. And I was just imagining my kids in that group walking, and I knew I didn't want to raise them there. So as soon as my wife was able to retire, which was 2 or 3 years after I did, we had already started building a house up here in LJ. My parents lived in Dahlonega part-time. So I had been up into the area, and I knew we used to sit out on the porch listening to cardinals and things, you know, and so peaceful. I said, this is where I want to live. This is where I want to retire. Yeah, and I've never looked back.
Well, we're happy to have you here in the Atlanta area. Does anybody want to ask Jeff anything? I'm keeping my eye on the chat, but if anybody wants to chime in.
You normally ask them about what they recommend to read.
Yeah, I'm not done yet.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just giving
All right.
everybody a chance to chime in before I do that. But that's a good segue. So Jeff, tell us do you have time to read? And when you do, what are you reading? And do you recommend anything for our readers to add to their read pile?
I do. You know, I've read and enjoyed so many different genres. The only genre I really can't get into is romance, like historical romance type things. Historical fiction I love, but romance, no. And once I became, I don't know when it started, maybe 5 years ago, I really gave up on all the big authors, Stephen King, James Patterson. There's just so many of them. And James Patterson was a big one for me in crime with his Alex Cross theory. I was going to talk to you a little bit about how I came up with Trufant's character, but maybe another time.
No, you can do it. So
I read all those genres: science fiction, horror, fantasy, thrillers of all kinds, spy novels, and so I had so many favorites. But then I started meeting all these local writers, especially with the Atlanta Writers Club. And I found it so much more enjoyable reading a book that somebody wrote that I've met personally, or at least is in my circles, because it's kind of like voyeurism. You get to peek into their imagination and get an idea of what's going on in their head. And somehow that makes their books that much more exciting to me. And I have a couple that I really remember that affected me. And one was, and they're not all crime or anything, but one was Robert Waltney's book, The Cicada Tree. I think I might have mentioned that to you once before. It's Southern Gothic. I didn't even know that was a genre, but I remember reading the first page. I met him at an author's event where I was actually supporting the bookstore by showing up, and he was the author. And I just liked listening to his excitement in describing his book. And the book sounded interesting. So I took a chance, bought it, came home and loved it. It was like magical to me. And then I read Echoes from a Lost World, or Another World. I had it written here so I would remember it. Here we go. Maybe not. Oh, well, anyways, Echoes from the Lost World. I know Ralph, Frank Fasson, it'll come to me, but I know that's the exact name of the title. It's a science fiction story, kind of a coming of age, other dimensional type thing. But I do like science fiction. I thought it was a very fresh type of take on those tropes. But the book I'm reading right now is Kimberly Brock's The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare. She's a local Atlanta author, also, I think, member of the Atlanta Writers Club. And I had seen her book flashing around Facebook and her name and everything. And so I took a chance. I went to Amazon and listened to her prologue. She has it on Audible also, and I listened to that. And I was just hooked on not just her skills themselves, but also on the narrator. And I found it was just a very nice hook. It's like Southern historical novel dealing with the South, Georgia, the Carolinas, and it's kind of reference to the lost colony of Roanoke.
Oh, I'm interested in that. Okay.
Yeah,
Good to know.
it's a
Okay.
lot to deal with that.
Yeah.
And so I have the book and I have the Audible. And while I'm driving, I listen to the Audible. But with Audible, I sometimes lose my place of what's happening. You know, traffic is doing things and I start forgetting who she's talking about. So I have the book and I go back to the book and I read that chapter and get refreshed and everything. So I'm really enjoying that. So if I had to choose one of them, I haven't finished the Eleanor Dare book. I would probably pick Robert Gwaltney's book. I think it moved me the most recently. There's been a lot of great books that I've read, but
Well, Robert was our off-the-shelf author in May. And
okay, so you're familiar with him.
yeah, and I'm actually reading The Cicada Tree right now. I'm in the middle of it. And if anybody wants to watch any of our past off the shelves, those are posted on our YouTube channel as well as through our Sisters in Crime website. And I think it's time for us to wrap up. One last comment from Annie. This is an awesome comment. She says, "You have an amazing wife." And she says hi to Susan.
I'll tell her.
Oh, and she's also saying you should do an Audible book of one of your books. You have a great voice.
Lieutenant Trufant is on Audible.
Oh, but who's reading it?
Audible is not an inexpensive platform. And so I'm kind of looking at the sales versus the cost, and I'm not sure it's there yet for me to do it with Leanne, Lean Man, but it's still a possibility.
Annie's saying you have a great voice. And
oh,
yes,
myself?
You should do it. That's why I was asking who.
I hate listening to myself. I'm like everyone else.
I do too. I don't like it.
Yeah.
I don't like it. My voice is so much higher on recordings than I think it is. And then I'm like,
me too.
Oh. Yeah. So, well, I have certainly enjoyed this and I really appreciate your time. And I really appreciate everybody in the audience who showed up. This has been, this is a good sized crowd for us. And you spent your Saturday morning with us listening to Jeff.
Great. That's great.
Fascinating.
Authors love talking about their books. All of them. So.
Well, and you were very easy to talk to, and there was a lot of subject matter, and we probably could have gone on for much longer. Right. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lance to close us out.
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks, Jeff, for a very entertaining and informative hour here on this Saturday morning. Thank you to everyone who attended, and a special thanks to our guests, and hope that you will come back for future Off the Shelf. Just a reminder, next Saturday at 10 o'clock, we have Reader Rendezvous, where you get to talk about what you've been reading and why you like it. And that, again, is open to the public, and we'll be putting out information about that in emails and on Facebook. And then coming up, that'll be on the 1st of July, and then following up on the 8th of July, our regular chapter meeting will be a hybrid meeting with Joe Cavich, who is the director of the Center for the Book, and it's co-located there at the Decatur Library. And we'll be meeting there starting in July at the Decatur Library. So it'll be live in person and it'll be available on Zoom. And we hope to see all of you somewhere soon. Thanks for coming, and good writing and good reading.
Yes, I like
And
that.
thank you all.
Hey, sorry for popping in and out so many times. My internet kept dropping me off in another room.
No, that's fine. I'm glad you were here.
Reading.
Hi, Mary. I saw you pop
I
in.
was like, Dawn's probably ready to kill me. I think I dropped 4 or 5 times. I was going upstairs to hang something off the balcony and it kept dropping me every time I walked up.
Technology.
Yeah. Gets the best of us sometimes.
These things are so fun.
Oh,
Is
I'm
that
glad
police
you enjoy them.
Yeah.
I tell you,
Can I ask a
really
nosy
enjoyed
question?
this.
Yeah. Mary wants to ask you a question, Jeff.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Is the police officer that you were talking to about writing a book, is it the guy whose partner went nuts and shot him in Roswell?
No.
Oh,
I want to say he said he was from Tennessee, and he didn't really go into any descriptions about how he was shot, other than it blinded him, hit his jaw, and took out a lot of his jaw. And he said he
Oh,
was
my.
hit 5 times, but he, I tell you, police officers really don't, I don't know what it is, but you just don't want to talk about things that have happened to you. I think I've gotten over that. I feel like I'm more of an author now with all these experiences I want to get out. But I remember as an officer, I would never talk about any of those things. But, like the suicide, I think, Dawn, I mentioned with you that the last time, I arrived, the girl was still very much alive. And, it was so traumatic, and I still am horrified by it. Now I'm horrified. I wasn't then. It was like, this is my job. I'm here. I'm doing these things. I'm going to keep her alive until rescue gets here. I'm going to watch mom over here to make sure, because the gun is still right there, and make sure she doesn't come in. All these things are happening, and I was not emotionally involved, other than feeling a little sad that this is happening, and knowing that there's nothing I could do. Kind of a helpless feeling. But now I think about that, it's like, oh my gosh, what a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Is it cathartic to put that down on the page? And
a lot of people told me, Jeff, this is going to be cathartic for you.